Oh, y'all come on in and have a seat. The bell has rung. Well, we're going to continue in our study of the time between the Testaments, and we're actually kind of in the wind down. We spent a lot of time in Old Testament prophecies, looking at them and showing how they were fulfilled in that time between the Testaments. And last week we started talking about the Grecian Empire. And today we're going to get into the Roman Empire. I'm going to make a few more comments about the Grecian Empire. But the remaining few lessons we have, we're going to be talking about a lot of things that have a very, very strong influence on the first century of the Jews, the first century in Palestine. And hopefully it'll help us understand a little bit better about why things happened in the first century in the New Testament, why the Jews had some of the attitudes they had, why they did some of the things that they did. Before we begin, I'd like to have a word of prayer. Bob, would you mind reading us that prayer? Amen. As I mentioned in past lessons, Alexander the Great ruled the Grecian Empire for a very, very short time, for about 12 years. In that 12 years, he conquered the known world. He never lost a battle. He showed great genius on the battlefield. He showed great cruelty on the battlefield and after battle. But at the same time, on some occasions, he showed great chivalry after the battle. He was a kind of a complex man. He was a student of Aristotle, and Aristotle's, I mentioned, I think last week, one of his philosophies was that if Greek attitudes and philosophies could rule the world would be at peace. Alexander made it his goal to have that Greek philosophy and the Greek language spread throughout the whole world, and he was successful at it. His whole empire, even though it encompassed lands from Africa up toward the Caspian Sea, all the way to the east to India, he influenced them, and Greek culture became the norm, if you will. The Greek language became the norm. The Koine Greek became the standard language for everyone. Now, while Alexander was doing all his things, the Roman Empire was slowly becoming or getting to be what it would become. But I wanted to mention some kind of a summary of some of the things that really we have to thank the Greek culture for. One thing I don't have in my notes is the whole idea of democracy came from the Greeks, and that was foundational in our country. And many of the Greek political philosophies that went along with that, we have in the United States of America even today. But as far as the New Testament in the first century, One of the greatest things that Alexander was able to do was get the Greek language to be the common language throughout all areas of the known world. It would remain the common language even after Greece fell, even after Rome became powerful. The common language of the world was Koine Greek. And the New Testament would be written in Koine Greek. And that meant that anybody who could read or anybody who could hear could either read or understand the letters that the apostles wrote, because they were all written in Koine Greek. Thus, it helped in the spread of Christianity. Remember, even at the crucifixion, 3 languages were written on the charge against Jesus: Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Remember that in the New Testament, read about a woman named Dorcas. That was her Greek name. Another thing that the Greeks did, and this was kind of a carry-on that the Persians started, particularly Cyrus, but communications and transportation throughout the Grecian Empire were greatly enhanced. They wanted business routes, they wanted communication, and later on, when the Romans took full control, they would expand this even more. And this helped Christianity spread in the first century. There was easier transportation than there had ever been in the history of the world by the time the first century rolled around. And the Greeks were they weren't the starter. I guess the Persians were the starter. The Greeks enhanced it, and the Romans even more. By the time the Romans came to power, Jews were in many parts of the known world. And this was largely because of the Greeks. They actually exported upwards of 100,000 Jews from Jerusalem to Alexandria. And Greeks or Jews were spread throughout the Grecian Empire, some by choice, some not by choice. But by the time the Romans would come to power, the greatest concentration of Jews in the world was not in Jerusalem, it was in Alexandria, down in Africa. And many of them were what we call Hellenistic. They had become Greek, they had adapted Greek culture, the Greek language, and to many of the Jews, this was a problem because their children were forgetting Hebrew and only knew Greek, and therefore their children couldn't even read the old scriptures, the Old Testament, the law of Moses, and all the prophecies were written in Hebrew. And when your children can't read it, it caused a problem amongst many of the seriously religious Jews. And thus that led to their agreement to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And they did so over a period of years, and that we still have today. It's called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint was meticulously translated by Hebrews. Ptolemy Philadelphus, he was one of the Ptolemaic kings down in Egypt, in Alexandria specifically. And he brought in 70 scribes or scholars from Jerusalem, actually probably 72, some from each tribe, and their task was to translate initially the Torah or the Pentateuch into Greek. And they did so, but they continued on, and over a period of about 20 or 25 years, they completed the translation of the entire Hebrew Bible, which is just the Old Testament, into the Greek. In the New Testament, in our Bibles today, there are many quotations from the Old Testament made by the apostles, especially Jesus also. And most of those quotations are straight out of the Septuagint. So thus the first century was greatly influenced by the Septuagint, and that the Jews were using that as their scriptures because most people still spoke Greek. As I mentioned, many of the Jews became Hellenistic. They adopted Greek culture. They adopted Greek language. and they also adopted Greek religion. And the Greeks had a whole system of gods, Zeus, and the Romans would later adapt that and rename them. But they had a whole system of gods that were supposed to live on Mount Olympus. And if you ever studied mythology in school, you've studied about that. They had a god for about everything. Well, many Jews, as they became more and more Hellenistic, began to sway toward that pagan belief and sway away from God. And again, this caused a problem with many of the Jews who wanted to remain faithful to the Lord and remain faithful to the law of Moses. Most of these Hellenistic Jews ended up, by the first century, being despised by the Orthodox Jews, and that attitude prevailed well into the New Testament, even into the church, as we read about in Acts, when the widows were being cared for, but the Hellenistic ones were not, that had become Christians, weren't being cared for. And thus the apostles had to appoint those 7 men to make sure that was done properly. But that was an attitude that the Jews had, the Orthodox Jews had against the Hellenistic Jews. And their attitudes when they became Christians didn't change totally, at least for a while. And that caused a problem in the church. And during the Greek times, we talked about this man, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a terrible man, a terrible ruler. He hated the Jews. He tried to eliminate the Jews, tried to eliminate the law of Moses. He tried to eliminate the worship of God. He desecrated the temple by putting up a statue of Zeus. He had sacrifices of pigs done in the temple. He did his very best to eradicate the Jews that were loyal to the Lord. And a group of Jews, Orthodox Jews, arose, we'll talk more about this in a week or so, called the pious Jews, the pious ones. They were called the Hasidim, or Hasidians. And they wanted to stay faithful to the law of Moses. And they did what they could to make sure that happened. And of course, that caused problems between the Jews who were wanting to be Hellenistic and those who wanted to remain faithful to the law of Moses. Eventually, that group of people, originally known as the Hasidim, would turn into what was known in the New Testament times as Pharisees. Now, the problem was, while their intention was very good, and they started during the Greek time of the Greek rulers, they began to have what became known as oral traditions. And those traditions, by the time the New Testament times came, the first century, those oral traditions had begun to replace actual laws of the law of Moses in their eyes as being more important than the actual law of Moses. And that would cause problems with Jesus and the Pharisees and the church and the Pharisees in the first century. I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I think, some of the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Aristotle. Some of their philosophy was think for yourself, or think on a spiritual level, or think logically. Actually, these thoughts and these ideas and attitudes were helpful to the New Testament church. Because if you think for yourself, you won't listen to what everybody else says. Every dictator in history never wants his subjects to think for themselves. He wants them to not trust themselves, to look to him. And don't think for yourself what's going on. Every dictator. And they try to squash those who would think for themselves. Well, the Jews in the first century, they listened to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. If they had only looked at the Old Testament prophecies and did a little thinking for themselves, of course, I can say this in retrospect, they might have seen that Jesus was the Messiah. But as it was, many of them did not. They didn't think for themselves. They listened to the leaders in the very crucifixion, the mob was yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." They were listening to the scribes who were, and the priests who were getting them fired up. They didn't step back and look at things on their own. And if they had been thinking logically or on a spiritual level, their attitudes might have been very different about Jesus and very different about the church, the kingdom that was established. If they had thought for themselves, maybe they would have realized that Daniel, hundreds of years before, had predicted during the reign of the Roman kings, a kingdom would be established which would never be destroyed. They had forgotten about that, or they ignored it in the first century, or most of them did. As I mentioned, while the Greeks were in power, all along the Romans were beginning to grow in power. I want to go through briefly, hopefully briefly, some secular history about the Roman Empire. Of course, the Roman Empire had a very strong influence on the first century and the church and the apostles and Jesus. Romans were in power at that time, and many things we read in the New Testament concern the Roman government and the Roman leaders. But initially, long before the time between the Testaments, in about 753 BC, a town called Roma was founded by, according to legend, Romulus and Remus. This is all legend. They were supposed to be two twins that were lost their parents and raised by wolves. That's the legend. Now, obviously, that's just a legend. But the town of Roma was established, allegedly by them, about 753 BC. About 735 BC, the city of Rome was founded. About 600 BC is when the dates that we apply today to the oldest Latin inscriptions. So we're talking about years past before there are even written archaeological things about the Roman Empire. So a lot of this, of course, passed down verbally from generation to generation. Thus, Romulus and Remus, I don't know the origin of that. I don't know how it came to be what it was, but the legend was they were raised by wolves, or a wolf. In 509 BC, the last king of Rome was expelled, and Rome became a republic. A republic. That means they had representative people in government. They had a senate, the Roman Senate. And these men represented the people as far as making laws in the government. And about 50 years later, and we don't read about this in the Bible, but it's significant to secular history. In 450 BC, what's called the 12 Tables of Roman Law were written down. And these were laws, this was essentially their constitution for the Roman Republic. They concern courts and trials and proceedings for courts. They considered laws about debts, laws about the rights of fathers, laws about guardianship and inheritance, acquisition and possession, land rights, laws about injury, laws about just public law, a sacred law, and then some supplements. But these were written down, and they're one of the earliest documents in human history about laws for a republic or laws for a country being written down. Well, about the time of the beginning of the time between the Testaments, Rome they weren't a powerful country, but they were there, and they started to make and do some significant things. You may have heard of in studies or reading something called the Circus Maximus. It was built in 326 BC. It was a stadium built expressly for chariot races. Do we do anything like that today? We have anything like that today? Here, I've never been to Indianapolis, but I hear that every spring there's a big car race there, Indianapolis 500. That stadium was built just for that race. Well, Circus Maximus was built for chariot races. Now, they had other events there that was built for. People haven't changed in centuries. In 312 BC, the Via Appia, the Appian Way, was built and opened. Appian Way was a road built by the Romans. Part of it is still exists today and is used. Over 2,000 years old, and that road is still in use. How many times do we have to repave our roads today? Every time I go to Dallas, you run into construction, every time. And it's roads that were built in my lifetime that they're rebuilding already. Roman roads lasted a long time because the Romans gave edicts to their engineers. If the road failed and they were alive, they were executed. So they did a good job. And I say parts of the Appian Way are still in use today, over 2,000 years later. And that same year, in 312 BC, the Romans built what's called the Aqua Appia, the first water aqueduct. The Romans had running water. No one in history had that before them. They built canals, aqueducts, from the mountains all the way into Rome. Sometimes they had to cross valleys, and they would build a bridge, if you will, that would carry water. And they carried it all the way to Rome. So they had literally running water in Rome in times before the first century. No one had ever had that. Yet the Romans did that. The Romans were great engineers, probably the greatest in the history of the world, because they did things that no one ever even dreamed about before. Another important event politically was in 287 BC, something called the Lex Hortensia was written, and it was laws about people, laws about the common people called plebeians. And it made the laws of the government binding on all people, not just the aristocrats and not just the plebeians, binding on all people. A new concept in civilized history and civilized politics. The law applied to everyone. We still have that philosophy today in the world, in our country. Rome was one of the first to have that, and they rewrote it down. Another important event, at the time between the centuries, 264 BC, Rome and Carthage went to war. Carthage was a remnant, actually, of the old Persian Empire. Carthage was founded by people from Tyre. We talked about them. And it became a very, very large country, a very large city, rather. It challenged Rome on the Mediterranean, and they fought a war. They fought more than one war. And neither side won. Neither side won. So it left them to fight another war later. 222 BC, the Gauls were defeated. Gaul was what we call today France. Rome expanded up through and took France. 4 years later, in 218 BC, a man named Hannibal, the leader of the Carthaginian army, invaded Italy. And that's when, if you study world history, he went to Spain. Instead of directly invading Italy, went to Spain, circled around, crossed the Alps, and attacked Rome from the north. And he took with him war elephants. Most of them didn't survive the Alps. They couldn't handle the winter and the winter weather. But some made it, and they were used very effectively against the Romans. And he won several battles in Italy against the Romans, but he never defeated them totally. And this would lead ultimately, finally, to the defeat of Carthage. But he made great strides and was able to do that. In that war, I wanted to mention some of this because it's kind of fascinating. Rome had a navy, and they've attacked the city of Syracuse. And Syracuse was on the coast, and its walls were up right on the water. And, there wasn't a beach, it was just a wall. And so it was very hard to take. And Archimedes, when they knew the Romans were coming with their fleet, he devised war machines. One was called the Claw of Archimedes. And this was a giant claw and a big crane that we would call. And when the Roman ships came close to the wall, they'd project this out over the water, and this big hook would go down and grab the Roman ship. Sometimes they grabbed it on the side and just turned it over. Other times, they raised it up out of the water and smashed it against the wall. And other times, they grabbed it by the bow and raised it up so high that it would just slip into the water. The Romans had very little success against it. It had a bunch of levers and pulleys to make it extremely powerful. Levers, pulleys. You've studied machines maybe in science and physics, early machines. And these all came from Archimedes. A lot of these came from Archimedes. It also had catapults that would launch large stones, and they would send these 500-pound stones out across the sea to hit the Roman ships. And they could bust through them, bust through the hull, and sink them. And according to some legends, he had a death ray. Now, this death ray is subject to lots of speculation. Allegedly, it was mirrors, polished mirrors, that Archimedes had made. And they were up at the top of the wall. And when the Roman ships came close, these mirrors would reflect the sun's light and concentrate it all in one spot on a ship in the hopes of setting it afire. Many historians believe they never existed. Something like it must have existed because the legend has made it through history. Some type of shining of light of some sort apparently existed. Legendary history called it a death ray. And it's our best guess today that it was some way of reflecting the sun's light. Nonetheless, Archimedes was a brilliant engineer in his efforts against the Romans. In 202 BC, about 10 years later, Hannibal was finally defeated by the Romans by a man named Scipio, and Rome destroyed Carthage, and they took Spain into their realm, and Spain became a subject of Rome. In 196 BC, the Romans defeated the Macedonian king Philip V, one of the last of the Greek kings and leaders. In 189 BC, a man named Antiochus III, he was the father of Antiochus Epiphanes, was defeated and surrendered his possessions, which had been part of the Greek Empire, to Rome, and they were in Europe and Asia Minor. So I'll say after Alexander died, as we talked about, 4 of his generals fought with each other to take control of the Grecian Empire. None of them ever totally defeated the other. But while they were doing that, the Romans are slowly gaining power and started to gain more and more territory, sometimes at the cost of the Greeks. 149 BC, Rome conquered a Grecian army and won the Battle of Corinth. And we read about Corinth in the first century in the Bible. The Romans captured it, destroyed it in 149 BC. 146 BC, after a 3-year siege, they did finally take Carthage. And what I found was everybody in Carthage, to the tune of about 450,000 people, were either killed or enslaved. So the Romans made sure that the Carthaginians never would cause a problem to them. The ruins of Carthage exist today, and they're still ruins. You can find them near Tunis in Tunisia. In 106 BC, the Romans defeated the Numidians, which is present-day Algeria. So they're expanding their empire into Africa. But while the Romans were expanding their empire, power and the leadership, people began to get jealous of others. And in 88 BC, there was a civil war that lasted for 6 years amongst Roman leaders. It eventually ended, but at about the time it ended, a man named Spartacus led a slave revolt against Rome. The slaves and the gladiators rebelled against Rome and Roman rule and their treatment under Rome, under Roman rulers. A movie was made about it. And the movie is accurate in the fact that the slaves and the gladiators lost. They ended up being no match for the Roman legions. And I don't think it's in the movie, I don't know. But when the war ended, Spartacus was killed, and many of those slaves and gladiators were crucified on the Appian Way. And they left him up there to rot, to discourage that sort of rebellion. And apparently it was fairly successful. About 68 BC, a man named Julius Caesar entered the Roman Senate as what was called a quaestor. He supervised the treasury, affairs of states, and the army. Julius Caesar. We read a lot about him in secular history. 4 years later, Syria, which had been a Grecian kingdom, became a Roman province under a man named Pompey. And 1 year later, Pompey would capture Jerusalem and he annexed Palestine to Rome. So in 60 BC, Jerusalem became part of the Roman Empire. In the next few years, Julius Caesar was elected consul, and something called the triumvirate was formed to avoid civil war. 3 Roman leaders, one named Crassus and Pompey and Julius Caesar, formed a triumvirate, and they ruled Rome for a short period of time. But they were jealous of each other. And secular history has much to say about that we won't go into. About 55 BC, Rome invaded Great Britain from France. They were unsuccessful, so the next year they did it again, and they actually took part of Britain. And today, you can go to Great Britain and see what's left of what's called the Hadrian Wall. And that was the northern extent of the Roman Empire. They made it all the way to Great Britain, to England. And when they went as far as they could, they built the Hadrian Wall to hold out the British. They weren't called British in those days, but the Hadrian Wall, the remnants of that still exist. About 2 or 3 years later, 49 BC, Julius Caesar, fought against one of the men of the triumvirate, Pompey, and defeated him. And he had already defeated Crassus about 2 years earlier, and thus Julius Caesar became the one that was left. And he called himself an imperator. That's in 49 BC. In 47 BC, 2 years later, he invaded Egypt, which was still ruled by the Ptolemies, and he was successful in capturing Egypt. He proclaimed a woman named Cleopatra as queen. Note that you may not know, Cleopatra was not Egyptian, she was Greek. But she was in Alexandria, and she was apparently very intelligent. She spoke several languages, and she had what we'll call relationships with Julius Caesar, but then later on with a man named Mark Antony. And we read about those events in secular history quite a bit. Something I wanted to mention, in 45 BC, Julius Caesar employed an Egyptian astronomer named Sosigenes to work out a new 12-month calendar. Up to that point in time, the calendar had 10 months. Our months, September, October, November, December. September was 7, October was 8, September Novem was 9, and Decem was 10. Those are the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the original calendar, the 10-month calendar that was in use at that time. Well, the calendar wasn't accurate, and because the end of the year kept moving and missing when the end of the solar year was. And if they'd left it alone, eventually, the end of the year would have been in the late summer after, a few hundred years. Well, the Romans recognized this, and they made a correction. Julius Caesar had a correction, and thus what we call today the Julian calendar came into existence. And what it did was it adjusted the length of the year and had leap years. You know what a leap year is? Every 4 years, we add another day to our calendar so that the actual solar calendar that the sun keeps, our calendar will match it. Later on, there was a problem with that because it wasn't quite accurate. Even though the Julian calendar had 365 days a year, every 4 years had 366 days, it started getting off also. This is in my notes, but you may know it. Later on, about 1300 AD, Pope Gregory and the Catholic Church decided to correct it. And they made a correction to that, and so today, every 4 years, we have a leap year. Every 100 years, we don't have a leap year, even though it's divisible by 4. But every 400 years, we go ahead and have it anyway. And this is all to keep our calendar in line with the solar calendar. So, for instance, 1900, which should have been a leap year, wasn't. 2000 was a leap year because it was on a 400-year, boundary. And that's called the Gregorian calendar. And that's what we use right now. It started, though, with that Julian calendar when he made 12 months. And guess where the name of the month July came from? Julius Caesar. Guess where the name August came from? Augustus Caesar. So the Roman Caesars had a high opinion of themselves. And that exists to this day, as we still have July and August. Anyway, just a little interesting side note. In 44 BC, Caesar was killed by his friends. They were afraid he was getting too powerful. If you've studied, I studied Latin in high school, and we read about Julius Caesar, and I think it's in one of Shakespeare's plays, Beware the Ides of March. The middle of March, on March 15th, Julius Caesar was killed. And one of his very best friends named Brutus was there at the event and actually stabbed one of the men that stabbed him. And the famous saying that Julius Caesar is supposed to have said was when he looked at Brutus, saw him with a knife, he said, "Et tu, Brute," which means, "and you, Brutus." Even his friend was afraid that he would have too much power, and thus he was assassinated. March 15th, 44 BC. That bell. That same year, after Julius was killed, a second triumvirate ruled Rome. This was Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. Octavian would later be called Augustus Caesar, or Caesar Augustus. Eventually, Mark Antony went down and married Cleopatra, but Augustus Caesar, Octavius, however you want to call him, had done away with Lepidus, and he would have a battle against Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and would be victorious in that battle. And he would become the one and only leader, and he would become the one that would declare himself, an emperor. And the Roman Empire kind of ceased to be a republic, and it became totally an empire. Uh, about 30 BC, Cleopatra, who had been killed, history tells us she committed suicide, and now Egypt became fully a part of Rome. And there's lots of stories about how Cleopatra did that with a poisonous snake. We don't really know, but that's the legend. Another thing I need to mention, in 20 BC, a treaty between Rome and what had been the Persian Empire, they were called the Parthians in that day, was signed, and a permanent boundary was established between Rome and Parthia. Now, the reason I mention that is the Romans had tried to invade Parthia and were unsuccessful. And they tried again and they were unsuccessful. They never defeated the Parthians, ended up signing a treaty with them. The Parthians were known for their cavalry, for riding white horses. Why is that important? Read the book of Revelation, and you'll find white horses mentioned there. And when the Romans heard about white horses in the first century, they thought of Parthians and how they were unable to defeat those Parthians. So to the first century people in Palestine, the white horse was a symbol of something that means absolutely nothing to us. It was a symbol that Rome was unable to defeat those Parthians who rode those white horses. I've read a few books about Revelation, and that helps us understand some of the things that are in Revelation. And I'll just mention this. I believe the people of the first century and the second century understood the book of Revelation probably a lot better than most people do today, because they knew what it was about. They understood what it was about because it had effect on them. Anyway, we're not studying Revelation, but it's an interesting thing. And about 4 BC or maybe 6 BC, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And thus began what we read about in the New Testament, and that's the end of that 400 years of non-action by God. So Rome was in power. We're going to talk some more about Rome next week because I didn't get through today. But Rome was in power. Rome had so many effects on the first century. The Jews in the first century, the church, beginning of the church, the spread of the church, the crucifixion. We can go on and on about the effects of Rome on the church in the first century. But keep in mind some of the things that happened back 100 years before, starting with Cyrus, actually starting with Nebuchadnezzar, but especially with Cyrus and with the Greeks and now the Romans, all are accumulated and in the memory of the people that lived in the first century, especially the Jews. The Jews had not ruled themselves autonomously since the days of the kingdom, since Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem. I'll mention next week, or in the next 2 or 3 weeks, that they did for a short period of time, in that period between the Testaments, have autonomy and independence from Rome and Greece with the Maccabees. But it was short-lived, and it was disastrous in many ways. But by the time the first century rolls around, the Jews have been under foreign rule for hundreds of years, and many of them are tired of it. What if Russia took America, and then China took Russia and took us, and it was 400 years down the road, and we haven't been an independent country in 400 years? Would our descendants be ready to end that? Well, the Jews were ready to end it. And it did end in one respect, but they didn't like the way that Jesus ended it. They wanted a different ending. We'll talk about that in the coming weeks, and I'm going to get through with this by the end of September. And then we'll have another class. Anthony will be teaching evidences out here in the auditorium. But keep in mind that time between the Testaments had a dramatic effect on the first century and the Jews, how they lived, what they thought, what they did, and thus it had a dramatic effect on Christianity. And many of those things we still have in our world today. So thank you for your attention, and we'll be dismissed now.